May 30th, 1431. The air in the old marketplace of Rouen is not just heavy, it is suffocating, thick with the acrid smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the electric tension of a city on the edge of a breakdown. Thousands of eyes are fixed on a terrifying structure rising from the center of the square, a plaster-covered pillar so high it seems to mock the heavens. Chained to the top of this monstrosity is a 19-year-old girl. She is surrounded by the ironclad might of the English army and the velvet-robed authority of the French church, powerful men who have dedicated an entire year to dismantling her existence. They believe that by lighting the faggots of wood beneath her feet, they will scrub her name from the annals of time.
They are catastrophically wrong. This is not merely an execution. It is the final theatrical act of a slow-motion murder designed to incinerate not just a human body, but a soul and a symbol. To truly grasp the horror of these final fleeting moments, one must peel back the layers of betrayal that brought her here. The tragedy didn't begin at the stake, it began with a transaction. In May 1430, outside the walls of Compiègne, Joan was dragged from her horse by Burgundian soldiers. She was the Maid of Orléans, the teenager who had miraculously crowned a king and broken the spine of the English siege. But in the cold light of captivity, she was reduced to inventory. For 6 agonizing months, she languished while kings and dukes haggled over her price in shadowed chambers. Finally, in November, the English crown agreed to pay 10,000 francs, a king's ransom, to purchase her. They weren't buying a prisoner of war, they were purchasing a weapon to destroy the legitimacy of King Charles VII. By December, she was transferred to Rouen, the nerve center of the English occupation. She was thrown into the grim, damp bowels of the Bouvroy fortress, placed under the personal, vindictive custody of the Earl of Warwick. The English command faced a complex problem. They couldn't simply execute her. Killing a prisoner of war would canonize her as a martyr and rally the French resistance. To truly win, they had to assassinate her character. They had to prove she was a heretic, a sorceress, a fraud. They needed to kill the legend before they could kill the girl. The stage for this judicial murder was set on January 3rd, 1431. An ecclesiastical court was assembled under Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a French churchman whose ambition was matched only by his loyalty to his English paymasters. He hand-picked a tribunal of 42 clerics, lawyers, and theologians, creating a court designed with a single, predetermined outcome: death. On February 21st, the formal interrogation began. Joan was hauled into the castle chapel, the metallic clanking of her heavy chains echoing off the cold stone, a stark contrast to the scratching of scribes' pens. She stood utterly alone, illiterate, malnourished, and exhausted, facing the combined intellectual might of the University of Paris and the Church. For hours, day after day, they fired rapid-fire questions at her, a relentless barrage designed to trip her up on theology, on the nature of her visions, and her insistence on wearing male attire. But their most lethal weapon was a theological paradox, a trap so cunning it was designed to be inescapable. They asked her, "Do you know if you are in the grace of God?" The room must have fallen into a deathly silence. It was a question with no survival option. Church doctrine explicitly stated that no mortal could know with certainty if they possessed divine grace. If she said yes, she was claiming to know the mind of God, a damning heresy. If she said no, she was confessing to being a sinner, effectively admitting her voices were demonic. It was the perfect snare. But the peasant girl looked the bishop in the eye and delivered a response that sliced through their logic like a sword. "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." The silence shattered. The interrogators were stunned, their pens hovering over the parchment. They had tried to outwit a simpleton and found themselves outmaneuvered by a saint. Yet between these intellectual duels, Joan returned to a reality far more brutal than the courtroom. Under canon law, a woman accused of heresy had the absolute right to be held in an ecclesiastical prison guarded by nuns. This was a non-negotiable protection to ensure modesty and safety. But the English discarded the law. They threw Joan into a secular military prison, deep within the fortress's darkest tower. There were no nuns here to comfort her. Instead, she was guarded by 5 hand-picked English soldiers, the housepayers, men who were chosen for their cruelty. 3 remained inside her tiny airless cell 24 hours a day, while 2 guarded the door. She was never alone, never private, never safe. The conditions were engineered to break her spirit.
At night, her ankles were locked in heavy iron fetters attached to a massive wooden beam at the foot of her bed. She couldn't turn over. She couldn't curl up for warmth. She was pinned like a butterfly, trapped under the leering, hateful gazes of men who blamed this teenage girl for their humiliating defeats on the battlefield. Witnesses later testified that the soldiers mocked her, woke her up to torment her, and subjected her to constant, terrifying harassment. But the danger was physical as well as psychological. During the trial, the judges developed an obsession with Joan's refusal to wear women's clothing. They called it an abomination, a sign of her unnatural wickedness. Joan tried to explain, but they refused to listen. The truth was practical and terrifying. In a cell full of hostile men, male clothing was her only defense. Her tunic and hose were tightly laced together with dozens of cords and knots, creating a physical barrier that was difficult to remove. A dress would have left her vulnerable to immediate assault. Years later, during the rehabilitation trial, witnesses revealed that a high-ranking English lord had actually entered her cell and attempted to force himself on her. Her clothing wasn't a fashion statement or a defiance of gender norms. It was armor against rape. By May, the pressure became unbearable. Joan fell violently ill, feverish and terrified she would die in that stone box without the last rites, her body dumped in a ditch. The judges used her physical weakness against her. On May 24th, they dragged her to the cemetery of Saint-Ouen. There, beside a freshly dug pit, stood a stake piled high with faggots. The executioner stood ready with his torch. The message was brutal and clear. Sign this paper admitting you are a fraud, or burn right here, right now. Joan was exhausted, isolated, and merely 19. Looking at the fire, her courage finally cracked. In a moment of pure human panic, she chose life. She agreed to sign a document of abjuration, recanting her visions. Her sentence was commuted to perpetual imprisonment on the bread of sorrow and the water of affliction. She was shaved, dressed in a woman's gown, and returned to her cell. The English were furious. They wanted her dead, not imprisoned. Stones were thrown at the judges. But the trap wasn't finished closing yet. The reprieve lasted only 3 days. On May 28th, Bishop Cauchon and the judges returned to the prison cell and found a shocking sight. Joan had stripped off the women's dress and was once again wearing the forbidden men's clothing. This was the relapse the court had been praying for. Under canon law, a heretic who repents can be saved, but a heretic who relapses faces automatic death. When they demanded to know why, Joan's answer was defiant. She told them that her voices, St. Catherine and St. Margaret, had scolded her for betraying the truth to save her own skin. She said she would rather die than live in chains. But history suggests a darker, more sinister reason for her change of dress.
Witnesses at the rehabilitation trial, 25 years later, testified that the English guards had deliberately stolen her dress while she slept, leaving her nothing but the male tunic and hose in a sack. They forced her into the very act that would condemn her. It didn't matter. The trap had snapped shut. The judges unanimously agreed.
Joan of Arc must burn. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, the end arrived. In a rare act of mercy that contradicted their own verdict that she was cut off from the church, she was allowed to receive the sacraments. Then she was led out into the blinding sunlight of the old marketplace. A massive crowd had gathered, surging against the line of soldiers to see the witch of the French. In the center stood the stake, mounted high on a plastered pillar, so high that the executioner would later complain he couldn't reach her to deliver the coup de grace, the mercy blow usually given to strangle the victim before the flames reached them. She was to die the hard way, fully conscious. As they tied her to the wood, Joan asked for a cross. In a moment of unexpected humanity, an English soldier broke a stick in two, tied the pieces together with rough twine, and handed it to her. She kissed it reverently and tucked it into her dress, against her heart. A priest then brought a processional crucifix from the church and held it up before her eyes, so it would be the last thing she saw through the smoke. The fire was lit. As the flames climbed the pillar and the heat became unbearable, the crowd didn't hear curses or screams of defiance. They heard a prayer. Over the roar of the fire and the crackling of wood, Joan cried out the name of Jesus over and over again. She did not scream in anger, she screamed in faith, until the smoke finally took her voice. She was 19 years old. The English were terrified that people would collect her remains as relics, so they ordered the executioner to rake back the coals and burn her body twice more, reducing her bones to unrecognizable ash. They gathered every speck of dust and threw it into the Seine River, convinced they had washed their hands of her. But they failed. 25 years later, a new trial, instigated by Joan's mother and the Pope, overturned the verdict. They heard from 115 witnesses who described the corruption, the intimidation, and the illegal procedures. The court declared the 1431 trial void, calling it what it truly was, a fraudulent act of malice. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. The men who burned her are remembered only as villains in her story. They tried to destroy a peasant girl to save a kingdom. Instead, they ignited a legend that would outlast their empires, a fire that burns brighter today than the one they lit in Rouen.